Welcome and thank you for attending. My name is Kellen Winchell and I'm a in-market senior business development officer for Alberta Agriculture. I am co-located in the Consulate General of Canada in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'd also like to acknowledge a few people who are our hosts this morning. First, my colleague Marissa Brewer, who some of you may know already. She's a senior trade development officer from Alberta Agriculture. I also want to thank our partner, Saskatchewan Trade and Export Partnership, STEP. Today we have Jay Albers, who is a trade specialist. So the purpose of today's session is to provide you all with the information regarding entry into the US market. We hope that you leave with a better understanding of what is required and different methods for your company to export to the US. Lastly, I like to mention that we will have a Q&A session following the presentation today. So if you have any questions, we would like you to enter them in the chat box, or you can also send them by email to Marissa or myself. I will put our contact details up here in a second. So myself, Marissa, and Jay will be assisting to get the questions addressed. So again, put them in the chat or you can email any of us on the screen here. Now I would like to welcome and introduce you to our speaker. Today we have Chelsea Washburn from American Spirits Exchange. She is head of growth and international shipping with the company. With that, I'll turn it over to Chelsea and she will start.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to meet you all. I just want to make sure, Kellen, if you can just give me a visual. You hear me okay?
Yeah,
perfect.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Perfect. I just want to ensure that before we get down the road too far. Firstly, thank you so much for having American Spirits Exchange today. I know Marissa and Kellen reached out to American Spirits a little while ago to request assistance with speaking how to enter the US. Just a quick tidbit before we dive in. Who is American Spirits Exchange? We are an importer here in the US. And yes, we handle a lot of Canadian wine, beer, and spirits. I'm so sorry, tongue-tied. Importing wine, beer, and spirits brands here into the US. We also, a big mission in our goals here is to always offer education and know-how to particularly international companies and producers like yourselves. So you might see our name from time to time in certain events like this, but it is with our pleasure and honor that we're here today. So I'm going to start sharing my presentation for you all. Start at the end. One more moment. Okay, so let's dive in. Again, here is our logo. You might have seen us in other missions of speaking with Canadian governments. We have done several over the past years. If you are new to an organization or an event like this, welcome. It's really, really exciting. Just a little blurb, you're going to get all this information from Marissa and her team at the end of this call, where you'll receive an actual PDF file of this PowerPoint presentation, as well as some further resources, and I'll loop that back at the end of the call, okay? But this title here, we're just letting you know where we are in this space, so you can remember as we are a leading representational importer here into the US. We offer services where we can have turnkey solutions for your brand and your company to enter here in the US. So that's enough for the shameless plug there, just so you let us know who we are. Let's get to the nit and grit and the good information and why it brings you all here today. So there's going to be 4 parts to this chat. We're going to talk here for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to have questions at the end. Of the 4 areas of this talk, we're first going to kind of dive into the background, those US historic moments or laws enacted that really makes the US today what it is as far as what are the requirements or how to import into the US. Then naturally, our secondary subject or topic will be what are those requirements that came out of those laws that were enacted. Third, we're going to really then dive into the international requirements, the international company requirements, and kind of look over or review. There's 3 types of models or modes to execute those requirements for international companies and producers like yourselves today. Fourth, then we're just going to touch base on some resources, like I said, that will be made readily available. The files will be readily available to you all via Marissa, Jay, and Kellen. Okay, let's dive in. Background. So this all comes down to why the US might appear to be a big monster or a big obstacle into entering the US is because there's a lot of paperwork, there's a lot of requirements. And the reason why is you can really pinpoint it if you go back in time to the repealing of US Prohibition. US Prohibition was in the 20s to the 30s, and it was honestly not a fun time. It was illegal to produce, sell, imbibe in alcohol. So I'm sure you're very familiar. There's speakeasies were on the rise in the US, bathtub gin. These are all cultural points that came out of that era. Now, what is kind of a common misconception of the US Prohibition and why it was a federally enacted time here in the US is that it was a movement of the temperance movement, right? Morality was low. Alcohol doesn't necessarily lead to good livelihood. Well, I'm not here to preach or anything, but that wasn't the reason as to why this became a federally enacted time here in the US. It actually came down to the realization of private and public sector realizing this commodity is a hot item that everybody wants to imbibe, everybody wants to enjoy. I'm sure you all have seen in the last 2 years, particularly sometimes when things aren't going well, alcohol usage even goes up, but I digress. So what happened was the private and public sectors were trying to figure out how to tax, how to get almost their piece of the pie, if you will, in all of these alcohol sales. Also enacting or ensuring rather that not one company or not one sector of government had a monopoly of sales. So, like I said, at the repeal of the US Prohibition, the US government, they adopted two policies that still hold today. We're going to go and look through those policies. Understanding these 2 policies are really key to understanding how to move forward in importing and selling your brand here in the US. Policy 1 that was enacted is something called the 3-tiered system. Now, I've spent several years speaking with many producers throughout Canada, wine, beer, and spirits producers. And about 50% of them are very familiar with the 3-tiered system as far as hearing that buzz policy, that buzzword. But not everybody knows the details. So let's kind of dive into that. Policy 1, the 3-tiered system. It's the US government limiting one's ownership's rights to a single role in the supply chain. You will see the supply chain here. Actually, I can mark this. You will see the supply chain here on the left side of the slide. It starts with supplier or producer, and the producer will bring it to the wholesaler to execute sale, and the wholesaler will sell it to a retailer. Now, for the purpose of this conversation, retailer is also synonymous with bar, hotel bar, specialty store. That's what we're going to call retailer when we talk today. But again, so the US government limited an entity's ownership to only operating on one step of the supply chain, meaning I wouldn't be able to come in with Chelsea Wine Import and import all of your products and then sell it directly to a retailer. It's not going to work. Or if I was a domestic producer here in the US, I wouldn't be able to produce it, sell it to a wholesaler, and sell it to a retailer. I can't be all 3 entities. I can't be owning the entire supply chain. Okay? And this was to promote competition and commerce. Policy 1, again, was the 3-tiered system. Policy 2, then, is state-level distribution. And that was deciding that the wholesaler here in the mid-tier, they would be the entity to govern sales at the state level, the distribution. Okay, so each state now regulates what alcohol can be sold within its borders, how that alcohol is distributed, taxed, how it can be advertised, and how it actually can be sold directly to consumers, i.e. me walking off the street and maybe enjoying your lovely product at a happy hour at a bar or walking into a specialty store. Okay. So again, these two policies, the enacting of the three-tier system and then the law of that the wholesaler is the entity to govern the state laws and how alcohol is sold to retailers and to consumers. That is why it's so complicated here, okay? So you need federal approval is required to even exist or produce or sell your product initially, but it's not necessarily sufficient to sell in the state governments because of that second policy, right? State governments have their own evaluation criteria, transportation, regulations, like I said, advertising and taxation. So since states really are controlling how your product is greatly disseminated within a state market, you really can't have a true one national distributor, okay? You really need to be working or approaching every state market here in the US as a separate country, okay? Almost 50 mini countries, as we have 50 states here. So, and this applies to domestic companies and brands here in the US as well as international, what I'm about to review here, that, and it's kind of echoing what I just said, but with these two policies of the three-tier system and state level, you're finding out that brands must first be approved at the federal level, okay? But they also need to be approved in every state they're being sold into, which further leads to that the company representing that brand here in the US must be permitted federally to get those federal approvals, and furthermore, be outfitted or find an outfit to properly register this brand on the state level. So now you really have to carve a way of how does my product, from when it gets in the bottle, be federally approved to move into the US and then state approved to sell. Okay, so federal approval just gets you onto US soil, and the allowable provision of that you can exist here in the US and store, but you just didn't bring the product in to store it and to look at it. You're bringing it in to sell it. So federal first to bring it in, and then state to actually sell. And there's not one blanket state approval, just to recap. You have to turn on or actually, open the door to get approval to each and every state. So it's just something to think about. I know I digress really quickly, but Marissa and Kellen shared me with some questions that they had asked you all today as where you are in the importation or thinking about importing into the US, where you are in your business plan. Majority of you are seriously considering and seriously researching to figure out your way to market entry. So this is perfect. Even for companies who are already import into the US, which I did see there were a couple, this is a good review, or this might be a great way to look and potentially pivot on how you're importing into the US. So let's really start diving in here. So you'll see 4 squares on your screen. These 4 squares are going to fill with what needs to be required for your brand to sell into the US. And this is honestly just a different way to show you all or create a checkbox that your product is officially approved to import and to sell, what we just covered, okay? Sometimes I find these boxes are really helpful. So it's going to be a requirement of your company, your entity, to be federally approved and state level approved. It is also required of your brand. Okay, those are essentially 4 boxes to check. For your company, the company would have to be, US companies would have to have a federal basic permit. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, we're not a US company. Don't worry, I'm going to get to that. But all companies representing a product of alcohol in the US have to have a federal basic permit, and that's issued from the US federal government to that company directly. Then that company must also obtain or have active what is called an out-of-state shipper's license. Sometimes this might be known by a different name, but the blanketed term is out-of-state shipper license into the states they're looking to do commerce in. meaning the state that they're looking to sell to that wholesaler, that mid-tier, okay? They must hold that license, that out-of-state shipper license to that state that they're looking to sell into. Again, this is what the company is required of the company that represents an alcohol brand. Now, that company must make sure that that brand, so we're on the second here, is federally approved by way of something called a COLA. COLA is an acronym, C-O-L-A, Certificate of Label Approval, which is handed or approved by the federal government as well. It's the same government branch that is approving the federal basic permit to a US company. Only US companies are able to submit for a COLA. It's going to be the US company that has the federal basic permit. So for example, American Spirits Exchange, we have a federal basic permit. Any COLAs that we get for the brands that we're representing, we apply for that COLA on that federal basic permit. Okay? The secondary thing, which is needed of your brand, and this again is to finalize that last step to make sure that your brand is legal to cross into a state line and be sold, essentially keeping you from bootlegging, is something called a brand registration here in the US. Okay, so that is the US company with that out-of-state shipper's license taking that COLA and knocking on that state's door and saying, hi, we would like to get this brand approved and this COLA approved on that out-of-state shipper's license. Say you're looking to ship into New York, for example. Your, again, US company that has gotten this COLA will knock on New York State door to make sure that you are all set up and approved, okay? Then your wholesaler can submit a purchase order for your product and you could be rest assured that that product can be fulfilled and sold legally. So now we're going to start diving into when you're getting your brand approved in the US, there's 3 things you need to be thinking about, okay? And we kind of touched on 2 and 3. Don't want to forget about this. So these are 3 things that your team always needs to think about when you are choosing to import, okay? For your brand, because again, you're not going to be a US company. So this is your biggest concern. You need to make sure that these 3 things are taken care of because again, you're not a US company. Number 1 is the food facility registration number. This is issued through the FDA, okay? Your chosen importer will be able to assist in facilitating this. Your facilities might already have one of these food facility registration numbers, okay? Maybe it was because you imported a year ago or you used to work with an old importer. That's okay. You would just need to check to see if it's still valid. The numbers usually stay valid for 2 years. 2, getting that federal review and approval process, getting that COLA, Certificate of Label Approval. So again, if you're working with a US importer, they would be the one to apply for it, but they're probably going to be working with you to make sure all the application pieces are in place prior to getting that approval on their infrastructure in the US, because it is based off your label. So they're going to be needing your marketing, your label mockups, those files, those are important. And number 3 is going to be the state review and approval process. So that's, like I just said, that's the state entity and your importer knocking on the state's door to get that COLA linked up and approved in that state of commerce, okay? These are just talking through those steps in detail. This will be good to review when we give you these files. Okay, so again, the US Food and Drug Administration, this is how you can look up getting one of those numbers if you need one. Again, you have to be a US-based agent, so you need to be speaking with an importer in order to finalize this number. Federal approval, the US government evaluates all alcohol beverage to determine if it's safe for sale, and it's based on the method of manufacture and the packaging. So that's what I was saying is whomever is going to be getting your COLA for your product, executing for your brand and products that you intend to import in the US, they're going to need the method of manufacturer, which is, a step-by-step on how your product was made, brewed, distilled, mashed. And then they're also going to need mock-up of your labels, which is showing the packaging, okay? That agency, that US company, they're gonna review the application and with our government, the US government, the TTB, and they're gonna issue the approval, okay? All alcohol beverages coming into the US must have a COLA. If alcohol beverages are trying to be imported into the US without a COLA, that product will either be turned around promptly or it will be destroyed with US Customs. I'm sorry, I touched my mouse. Again, US-based companies only that have a federal basic permit can apply for a COLA. Let's move. Now let's start thinking about your models or modes of importation. And when you're thinking of federal approval, I'm sure everyone here on the call, they're starting to think of, okay, so if it's a US-based company only to get these federal approvals for my product to even enter the US and clear customs, how do I start thinking about that? So some things to consider, aside from a US-based company is the one that to do these steps, is if the US company isn't the actual brand owner, which say a US importer, they're not going to be a brand owner or the producer of an internationally based product, right? I am not the owner of your beautiful products. I might just be a facilitator or the importer. If we are not the actual, if the US company is not the producer, then we must be named the exclusive agent for that product into the US. And as an international company, your team would need to provide an authorization letter. Okay, we're right here, naming that US company as an exclusive agent. Traditionally, the US company that you're entering this agreement with will provide you with a template of a letter template and how to name your US exclusive agent. There are very strict requirements for this letter. And again, that US company should be the one supplying you with that letter to fill out yourself. Okay, once the COLA is approved, or next bullet here, only the US company that submitted for that application approval for that COLA can actually import the brand itself, okay? Nobody else can import. If you come to an agreement, the person or entity that receives the COLA, if they are not importing, you guys might work together to authorize it to another importer to clear and import the product, but I digress, we'll get into that later. Some implications and consequences to be thinking about. The US company that files and receives the COLA is seen as its holder here in the US and therefore has exclusive and full control of the brand in the US. So we're going to kind of dive into this and explain, or so you explain the responsibility of people who hold the COLAs here in the US so you guys can understand who has control. We're going to get to that. If at any point your company wishes to sell to a different US company, then you need that COLA holder's explicit permission, okay? So meaning the first COLA holder needs to authorize and essentially hand over that COLA to the new COLA holder or the new importer. And there's steps for that to be done. This will be in tandem with that new COLA holder having to apply for a new one under their federal basic permit. Something else, and we're going to dive into this in a second, to be considerate of or to think about is when you're using one US company for two roles here in the US, which is a COLA holder or your importer and your customer, meaning the person is actually purchasing the product from you, it can really start limiting your negotiation position and control. We're going to get to that. It is very possible to separate these roles. And you can use one company as a representation person of your brand, okay, the COLA holder, and have it being separate from your customers, which would really keep control in your court. We're going to dive into that. So once the ownership of the cola is ironed out, and then your team has considered all the option and how you're going to get your cola and import into the US, and you start considering how to get set up in your states, just note that nearly all states require a brand to be reviewed and approved before you can sell into its boundaries. Okay, each state has its own evaluation criteria, its own submission forms. There's not just one way to do it. Some states are still operating where you have to mail in everything via paper through the mailing, the federal mail. Some do have online portals. Some have, you have to do both steps. Every state is completely different, because if you remember, that second policy enacted after US Prohibition era ended was that each state could determine how they govern this process. State registrations are always going to be submitted by the COLA holder or the designated party in the state, meaning in some states it can be the wholesaler if the COLA holder authorizes, but we'll get to that in a different point. So now I just want to take a quick breather. That was very dense of just ways of how your team, this is probably the most important section here of this talk today, of how your team can think about potentially importing or changing your way or method of import here into the US. So really quick recap, we already spoke about how the laws that need to be considered into importing the US, right? Three-tiered system, and that the wholesaler or distributor, which is an interchangeable term here in the US, how they can execute sale, okay? Then we spoke about, okay, what is required of your company and of the brand to be approved to sell to, say, your state distributor in New York City, your state wholesaler in New York City. We reviewed that. But then we quickly ascertained that your company directly can't be the company getting the approvals that are needed because you are not US based, okay? So those slides previous to this was just to kind of show you what's being executed on the US side so you understand the steps. Now what we're really going to dive in is, how do you guys want these steps executed? Where do you guys have the control? Where do you all have the responsibility as a non-US based company? Okay, so we're going to call this section, it's models of market entry. There are 3 ways that your company can consider importing into the US. One is one party or one entity is doing everything themselves. We'll get into that. 2, there's one party, but the person who has your COLA holder, or the person who is your COLA holder, the company, is also your customer. Meaning, I'm an importer. I'm not only getting your federal approvals in place for your product, because I already have the federal approvals in place for my company, but I'm also purchasing the product directly from you, maybe directly from your winery, brewery, or distillery in Canada. Okay, and then the third mode is a 2-party system where your COLA holder, your importer, is completely different from the person who's actually purchasing the product. Okay, so again, there's 2 versions of one party here. First one, you do everything yourself. Second is the COLA holder or the US company is also your consumer directly. And 3, 2 parties, meaning the COLA holder and your consumer or your customer, 2 different people, 2 different companies. Across these models, there's varying degrees of brand control, cost, and profit. And those are the 3 points that we're going to review when we look at every model. I want to emphasize that there is no one correct model or not just one way to import. It is very, very dependent on what your company needs to achieve or wishes to achieve in the US market. So, like I said, you might find your mode might be you're doing everything yourself. However, maybe a fellow brewer down the road, they might think, oh, you know what, we're going to go mode 3, a 2-party way of importing to the US. Completely fine. There is no one right way. So really high level here, I'll show you here by this diagram Model 1, like I said, we're going to talk about brand control, your risk, and your profit margins in these modes of entry, in these models of entry. Model 1, you control the brand, meaning you're selling to state distributors. Okay? This can be a very expensive, costly model. This is usually for companies who are essentially building a US branch of your company in the US. Tends to be older companies with brands that are well established in multiple markets already. Model 2 is your customer controls the brand. That means your buyer, and that's you're selling to an importer directly. Then this is importer sells it at their margin and at their business strategy. You would have no say on how an importer would sell to their state distributor. For you, this is an inexpensive way to enter into the market. However, it's potentially low profit margins. Model 3, we're back to you control the brand here, okay? You're selling to distributors. And again, you have inexpensive costs initially up front to lay out this potential model to entry, but your profit margins potentially have the possibility of being higher margins than, say, Model 2. I'm just going to look at this in a different visual way because people learn differently, okay? So again, you're going to have your COLA up here, the COLA holder, and then the purchaser, which is your state distributor, okay? So Model 1, you are the COLA holder, your purchaser is the state distributor or state wholesaler. You will see they're completely different circles, completely independent of each other. You will see Model 2, where the purchaser holds the COLA, and they also are the person to purchase and resells to the state. You will see their circles overlap. Model 3, you will see that an agent gets the COLA on your behalf, and then they would sell under your direction to a state distributor. So again, these are separate. So this is, again, just a different visual way to see how these are similar or different. So let's dive deep here. Model 1, you're doing everything yourself. You set up your own US presence and act as your own importer. So this takes a lot of know-how, hiring of a completely another team here in the US. I'm sure you can imagine all the different steps you would need to take. You're opening another branch of your company. And therefore, that company also could be either executing all the import and or even production in the US. I'm going to go over the pros really quickly. High per case margin and profit. Complete control of the brand identity. You would have complete control of where you all decide to sell or who you're selling to, right? Protection of the brand by holding the COLA. And this, if you remember an earlier slide, whomever is the COLA holder in the US here is also seen as the owner of the brand in the US federal court, okay? Your team would have direct relationships with your state level distributors or wholesalers. That could produce really great business partnerships and might even trickle down to higher volume sales, right? Because your team would be managing this directly with your purchaser, your customer. What are some cons? Buy upfront fixed costs. Like I said, setting yourselves up, very costly here in the US. Lead time of many, many months to years to make sure you're obtaining all the necessary permits, bonds, and company registrations your team would need to have in place in order to make sure that you're either importing the product properly from your Canadian site, or actually producing it here in the US. Now, this particular model, although is very appealing because you'd be controlling all steps of your supply chain, of your importation chain, and you'd have direct relationships with your consumers or your purchasers here, which are the state level wholesaler. It's really appealing. It is a lot of work, okay? Absolutely admire anybody who is considering this way of import Just know it can take a lot of steps. 2, model 2, if you remember, it looks like this, where there's 2 circles overlap as far as ownership of the product. Your customer is the cola holder. This is a real traditional way to import here into the US. This is how internationally produced products initially entered. Okay, this was the first way to enter into the US market. It is because it's the path of least resistance for the international producer. And what I mean by that is that the importer is going to approach you all and be your buyer. You actually might even be called buyer method to import, which that means if I was my own importer, I didn't work for American Spirits Exchange, I was just Chelsea Imports LLC. Say I came to one of your distilleries, breweries or wineries in Canada, loved a few of your offerings, offered to you, hey, I would love, let's say, I want your Canadian rye and I would love your 8-year whiskey, just for example. I really see 3 states in particular where I'm set up to sell. I think these products would do great in those 3 states. And just for example's sake, let's say those 3 states, let's go West Coast, California, Oregon, and Washington. Okay. So you say, wonderful, we'd love to partner with you. Wonderful. So that means I'm going to submit a purchase order for your product. Let's say I want 2 pallets of each product. Okay. Then you would just issue a commercial invoice. I pay you for that product. And then the onus is all on me and my team to ensure that product is steadily approved, give you the green light that this can ship, however the shipping arrangements might be. My team would clear the product with US Customs as it approached the border. I would warehouse the product, and my team would work on selling the product to, again, those state level distributors in any of those 3 states, because my team worked on getting the product approved in those states to sell. So this is low margin of risk, low margin of costs for you all when you're looking to import your product. However, there's a higher risk of your product not necessarily being sold or represented the way you wish it would in US market. You lose all control, okay? All control. Again, right here, disadvantage is you're losing control of your brand. You're limiting your negotiation power. And when I say limit your control, maybe your team does a trip to California. You see your product in a California retail store, and it's not exactly the message, or it's not how you would go about selling product. Unfortunately, your team would have no say. You relinquished your say when you were selling directly to the importer, who was also going to be the seller to the state. Okay. So again, pros, low capital investment, and it's really straightforward sale of product. You do not need to worry about maintaining those relationships or partnerships in the US. Your importer is going to be taken care of that all. You do have a lower margin for profitability because you're only making your profit from that sale directly to the importer. You lose control over your brand identity, sales, and marketing. No market connections with your buyers. All control of the brand is relinquished to your customer, which would be your importer. And you may be subject to sales and agreements following termination of your customer. So meaning, heaven forbid, the importer, you decide to not move forward with that importer, your team might still be on the hook for negotiating the ending of fulfilling that brand to the state level. Okay. This is a really great method for people who are looking to kind of dip their toe into the US initially, seeing if it's for them. Meeting with importers or buyers at potential trade shows would be a really great way to see how you could, if this would be your path for entry, especially if you are meeting with importers who are showing you numbers you really like. Model 3. Now, Model 3 is you are separating control. You're separating who is getting your cola and who your customer is. Okay, this is the 2-party method. Now, how this can be executed is by way of representational importer. That means that these importers aren't executing COLAs or federal approvals of brands that are international to sell them. They are issuing a service or have a turnkey solution in order to get your brand imported in the US. Okay, that's all. And it's all under direction of the producer. So the producer would be the one to sit with these representational importers. American Spirits Exchange is one, just FYI, if you couldn't read between those lines. You would sit down with a representational importer. You would tell them the brands that you are looking to import here into the US. You would let them know which states you're going to be doing commerce with. So it's really your team to be putting a lot of onus on figuring out what of your products you want to import, where you want to sell, securing that state level, state distributor or wholesaler customer. You would be conducting that sale directly. A representational importer would just be making sure that your federal COLA is set up in the state that you're wishing to do business in. Now, behind the scenes, the representational importer, their company is US based. They're already set up federally and in states to execute all of this. They have the infrastructure in place. They just need to get the brand approved federally and on the state level. If you go back, remember the slide with the 4 squares. So working with a representational importer is almost, you're leaning on your representational importer to make sure that all these boxes are checked. They're going to guide you through this. And you're not starting at step 1 because, like I said, they already have the infrastructure in place federally and state level for the company. They're just linking your brand up to those steps federally and state level. So your company can really be focusing on, finding those state wholesalers, those state distributors, executing those relationships, getting those sales, right? So this model is really appropriate for international clients who seek to really keep or control their brand identity in the US, protect how their brand is being positioned and sold into the US, and who really want to put their own development into creating their own relationships with their state level wholesalers or distributors, okay? This particular model I've seen brands do very well with at any size of company. If you are a new producer and you may only have 1 or 2 products and US might be your first country that you're going to export or import into, right? Because you're keeping your control, you're kind of getting your toe wet. We've seen it for national brands in the US. We represent many national brands who are selling in every state, but they really want to keep control of their product. And they might not be at the step or have interest of actually setting up a US branch of their company, okay? You could kind of think of this model as outsourcing that need to creating your own US company, okay? Some pros to this model is high per case margin and profit, complete control of your identity. You have protection of the brand by holding the COLA. So representational importers, yes, they'll be applying for that COLA, but they're not going to have any say over the COLA because agreements in place will say that you are the holder of it and that you're going to be the ones facilitating or instructing where to sell this COLA into which state. You're going to maintain those direct relationships with state level distributors because you're in charge of all your marketing and sales on this type of model, okay? And like I mentioned, back to model 1, when your team is directly in charge of maintaining relationships with your consumers and with your customers, it always translates to stronger, higher sales. It is a lower investment of capital for initial entry, and you have quicker access to the market because you already have your representational importer already has the stepping stones or infrastructure in place that you're just leaning on them. Cons, your team is full responsibility for your own sales. You have low fixed case fees for this service. Usually representational importers, they're offering a service. They're going to have service fees to executing all this for you. Another con is there is a really limited number of reliable national importers. There's really in this space 4 to 5 that are really big players in the space in the US. So again, quickly to review, Model 1 is when you're doing everything yourself. You have a US-based company, your US-based company gets your own federal and state licensing set up and the brand approved under those licensing. Model 2, your purchaser and your importer is the same person, okay? So cooler holder or your buyer, your importer comes to your distributor or your distillery, they purchase your product, they import that product, and they oversee the sale to that state or whole distributor. You're essentially cut out of any business or marketing decisions in commerce once that product is purchased by the importer from your distillery, winery, or brewery. Model 3 is when you have employed a representational importer or agent here in the US to get your cola for you on your team's behalf while resting on their licensure, and furthermore, then dictating or lying those steps out with that team, with that representational importer team, what states you need turned on or approved in to do commerce with your state decided upon state distributors or wholesalers. That was a mouthful, I apologize. Okay, and so that really brings conclusion here to my chat. Moved pretty quickly there, but I just really want to open the floor for people's questions because I understand, everybody's different. Every producer has different production levels. What you're producing is all different. So I was really looking forward to hearing from you. But just know that American Spirits Exchange, like I mentioned at the top of the call, we are representational importers, absolutely. And we do always look for new brands to import and to assist with. But a huge chunk of our mission statement by our founders is education and making sure that people whom are contemplating importing into the US really have resources available to them, published papers to really understand how to import and how to navigate the US market. So a part of me not only speaking today is sharing these resources with you. I have shared them with Marissa, Kellen, and Jay, and they will disseminate them to you all. There'll be PDFs, white papers, as well as my contact, so you all can reach out and we can have some conversations while you're, looking or considering how to import. Full disclosure, American Spirits Exchange, we might not be your fit. We're not looking to be a fit in this space. We're really looking to educate first and foremost. These will be a rundown of what you'll be receiving. The calendars, or the calculators rather, I have not sent those to Marissa yet just because they're really highly in depth. I would like everybody to review all the white papers and case studies that we're sending over to Marissa and our team that are sending to you prior to diving into the calculators. You can always reach out to me. And here's my contact, okay? Okay, everybody, thank you very much. I think I took up a lot of your time.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. That was really excellent. And I hope everybody was able to follow along as best they could. I think a lot of our attendees have called in, and I'm not sure if they have access to the chat. And so I'm just trying to see here, perhaps there are people on the call. Could see if we could try to unmute some of them.
Sure, absolutely. Should I mute myself, Kellen, for ease, or?
I think what we could do is let's have you stay on. I'm just trying to see what we can do here.
Sure.
I'm just going to, I think, as Kellen mentioned, due to our technical difficulties, we have a lot of people on the call. What I'm going to do for those of you that are on your phone, I'm going to make you a panelist so that you'll have the opportunity probably to unmute, as I don't think you can type. But in the meantime, while I'm doing that, I just wanted to ask Chelsea a quick question of, you talked about, and I guess it would depend on the brand and the type of category that the product falls in, but do you, right off the top of your head, know of any states that are no-goes? That's a question I get a lot. And any states that tend to have maybe more opportunity for Canadian brands. So I'm not saying, you know exactly which ones are the right fit. There's probably different states that are a better fit for certain products. But is there any particular ones that might, you're seeing more opportunity that brands are going to? And with that, I'll see if I can make the people on the call panelists so that they have an opportunity to talk.
I'd be happy to answer that question. So it's a convoluted answer, unfortunately. Canadian spirits, particularly, they've been very strong in the U.S. market, and that strength continues to grow. We have huge craft movements across all categories: beer, wine, and spirits here in the U.S. Traditional markets that I have seen really pick up with Canadian offerings are the states that actually tend to border Canada. In New England states, so Maine, Vermont, New York, I've seen those categories grow. And then out west, Oregon, I know that doesn't necessarily border, but Washington, Montana, those are some of the states I've seen growth. I say that, but I also need to say this in the same breath. I am not a fantastic example of a salesperson or a broker who is really paying attention to all of those cues or could help guide. So there's a few ways you can do that. There are brokers or solely sales companies here in the US that all they do is want to meet with people like yourselves and decide, hey, where can we carve your space? That does exist here in the US. There are companies that do that. I would also suggest, in the US, you have your biggest 5 markets in general for purchasing alcohol are California, Florida, New York, Texas, and Illinois. Those are your biggest markets and largest markets for alcohol, the different offerings, number of SKUs or brands in those states, as well as high volume sales. It's because they have the leading populous cities, right? What I would recommend to particularly a company that's new to importing in the US, maybe not going after those states. Sure, definitely have them in your vision, absolutely. But I have seen some great entry strategies from some of our companies where they go to maybe a tier 2 volume state, right? Where they're going to the Dakotas, they're going to Iowa and Idaho, they're going to Missouri and Kansas, Midwest, smack in the middle of the state. And they pick up great traction because those states are just as hungry. I just feel that there are a lot of international companies who choose to overlook them because they hear those top 5 first and they want to be a part of that pie, if you will. And again, of course they do. I get it. But don't overlook the other guys.
Thank you, Chelsea.
Of course, my pleasure. Now, to any producers on this call or that we're seeing this recording, if you would like to explore potential sales services here in the US and meet with some of these people, I do have a short list of Rolodex of some people who are looking for Canada product. I would need to have some information about your company prior, but I would be happy to introduce at a point in time. Be my pleasure.
Thank you for that, Chelsea. I think I have another question to ask you, but before that, I have made all of those on the call that dialed in panelists. So I believe you have the ability to unmute yourselves. It looks like everybody's just got unmuted. So if somebody has a question, I think we'll do a quick pause and you can speak up here with your question. Okay, well, we're kind of waiting. I'm just going to mute panelists again. Unmute you, Chelsea. Okay, so I do have another question. So for those, we're seeing a lot of new, fun, innovative products coming up using interesting ingredients. What are some of the, I guess, suggestions to companies that maybe are doing some of those unique ingredients that maybe want to enter the U.S. with those products? What will be some of the challenges for them with those type of products?
I'm really glad you asked this question. Very glad you asked this question. Yes, I'm sure you all are seeing a rise in some creativity in products, particularly the category ready to drink, RTD. Um, and for those people on the call who have a different product like that, or have flavoring in any of your products that might be more straightforward. Maybe you have a maple whiskey, right? There are going to be extra steps that your importer is going to have to execute with you to get that approved. Here's the beauty of it. The category of all this of RTDs or the creativity of so many international producers has grown. Therefore, more precedent is being set every day with how to get something approved. What I would always recommend is if you have some interesting ingredients or a method of manufacture for your product, you guys have every right to give the FDA, Food and Drug Administration here in the US, give them a call, spend some time on the website. Look for things that are called GRAS, GRAS, and it stands for generally regarded as safe. Everything on that list should not have any issues of getting approved, okay? Now, importers would be doing this in tandem with getting your COLA. I didn't want to get into the weeds too much about that step, but it does happen. And these formulas or these flavorings, they're going to get approved before the COLA does. And if perchance anything the FDA and the TTB, the US federal government here, doesn't like, they're going to let us know. They're going to let your importer know. They're going to say, hey, oh, here's one that we just had an issue with. Seaweed. It was a certain kind of seaweed out of Scotland that actually was peat moss as well as seaweed. The FDA did not want to get that approved to be able to drink. So there's a couple options. You either hire a lawyer to fight the FDA to get something approved, which can be very costly. You give, sometimes it's just seeing a little more information about the product itself and then it gets approved. So it's just a little extra back and forth, maybe a couple extra weeks extra. 3, you actually make a US recipe and you take out that ingredient and then you move forward with the US. So we've seen people take all 3 steps. Importers should genuinely be able to say, hey, can't get this approved. We just need a little more information of what's going into it, how much of the product, or do you have any further information from maybe where you're getting this ingredient from so we can get it approved. The things that I've seen kicked back the most, anything like seaweed related. I'm not exactly sure why. That's really has caused us some issues in the past couple of years that I've seen. And then any type of red dye coloring, there are certain ones that are allowable and not. Depending on who you're working with and how you choose to import, your importer should be able to have these conversations with you. Saying, they're going to be able to, if they're doing a lot of these, they can red flag and say, you know what, I know right away this isn't going to get approved because of this particular ingredient. So you're either going to have to change it or I'm going to need some more information. I hope I didn't digress too much, but if it's something really wonky, I would always suggest to have your importer review it before you would sign anything that they're actually going to get you imported, or say, do you foresee any issues with this? Because I would hate for people to get into a relationship with an importer without those papers being reviewed. And then the importer's like, well, we can't get it approved. And now you're in this business relationship. You don't really know where to go.
Thank you for that, Chelsea.
Of course.
Another question I had too, say the company's not ready and the brand's not ready to enter, like you said, into a relationship with an importer, but they want to get some samples to the US. What is the process for that? I know you touched on some of that in your presentation, but just to make it, I guess, clear of, say they're looking at getting those samples there right now. That's what stage they're at.
Yeah, so that can be done. The process is called COLA waiver. And what it is it would still have to be applied for by an importer. And a lot of importers, if you're looking to do business, they'll do this for you for just a fixed cost because they understand it's international product that's you're trying to figure out where it's going to be most viable, right? Full disclosure, ASE does this for anybody who needs this service. You do not need to be a full-time client. So if that's a connection, if we can support people on this call, we'd be happy to do so. I can send those rates of what those are to Marissa if you wanted to disseminate them to anybody on this call. But essentially, it's the importer would just request the volume, how many bottles are you looking to import? The ABV, just tell me a little bit about your product. We actually have a work ticket that our people just fill out, send back to us. We would apply to the government for this COLA waiver, meaning, hey, this producer wants to bring in some product. It is not for sale. It's for sample usage only. There's no label to actually even get approved. You can't hold it for approval because it's not for sale. They put a big embossed stamp on it, digitally send that out back to the importer. Then the importer would share that COLA approval to the producer and with explicit details on how to ship. And they can move forward in readying and ship. There's very explicit directions. I can't speak for all importers that execute this service, but ASE, we give them all step by step and what would be required to make sure that you're shipping that product legally and the product doesn't get lost in the ether of, FedEx, UPS, DHL, that it actually does clear customs and get to us. A few cases, not a problem, that will always get approved. Once you start getting north of, a dozen cases without an explicit trade show reasoning, you kind of risk the TTB or the federal government saying, yeah, we're not going to approve this one, it's too much product.
Thank you, Chelsea.
Also, of course, I'm so sorry. And a COLA waiver can only be used once. You can almost think of it as a admissions ticket to a movie theater or to a concert. But if you were to need to send another shipment, you would just ask for a new waiver.
Perfect. That was going to be my next question. So thank you for answering that. I think that's all the questions I have. I'll turn it over to Kellen. Again, though, if anybody has any other questions after this webinar or after you're watching this recording, as I know many could not, unfortunately, tune in live, please feel free to reach out. And that's it for me. And I'll hand it over to Kellen.
Great. I actually did have one question for Chelsea. It may be a bit of abstract, but obviously our clients here on the call and others that will be tuning in are going to start to have some conversations with those importers or distributors. And what are the, key questions they should be asking or key things they should be looking out for when they're going to be entering these business relationships?
Yes. So, depending on which method you're considering, I would imagine the majority of people attending this call or receiving this recording are going to be choosing Model 2 or Model 3 to entry. So you're going to be working with an importer. You're not going to be starting your own actual US-based company. So questions to ask your importer would be, if it's Model 2 and that importer is the actual buyer and will be in charge of sales for your product, talking about what states do you have access to sell? Not every buyer or importer will have all 50 states available to them to sell to. They might just work in a tri-state area, maybe 2 different tri-state areas where they're covering 6 states. Really understanding what their reach is, what their goal is for your brand. Does that match up? Asking them, what price point do they see selling the product in? Is it the same what you see? That's really important. I've seen brands who have entered into the US into the buyer relationship, and then they find out the product's not at the tier they wish it was. That would be something really great to speak with your importer with in one of those first conversations. So their reach, which states, how do they plan to market it, and price point. Really making sure that's aligned, because you also want to make sure that you can provide them with enough product, right? Sometimes you always are going to have growing pains, particularly in this industry, but sometimes we've had a few people who hit the ground running, opened up a bunch of state markets. They can't keep up with demand. They can't keep up with production. So really having a realistic expectation of how much product can you issue to this importer? How quickly are those sales going to happen? And again, what states? What's the reach? Are you guys on that same page as opening the same states or selling to the same market and then agreed upon price point? Now, if you're using a representational model method where the importer is the cola holder, but you're going to be directing the sales, really understanding, how is your team going to be executing opening markets and launching and sales? How are you going to maintain it? It's really hard if you simply don't have boots on the ground here in the US at least a few times a year. Having the wherewithal or the means to be sending your team here to the US to meet with state distributors. So making sure that that's really understood if you're using a representational importer. They are not in charge of marketing, sales, or launching. They are doing all the licensing, the importation, and the logistics of making sure they're offering you warehousing. If you want to create, store product here and have just wholesalers pick up, don't want to digress too much, but understanding that. Also understanding the number of products that you're bringing into the US with your representational importer means it's more onus on your team. I know some people have a full gamut of 12 different offerings of product, and that's awesome. But sometimes bringing all 12 at once into the US won't work. So you really need to kind of look at yourself and say, okay, if maybe we only start with 2, grow traction in those 2, and then we come in with all 12 in a year or 2. Okay. So those would be those 2 different modes of those 2 different kinds of importer. Those points I would hit.
Okay, great. And then one last question. What if unfortunately you've starting to work with the importer and much like you said, you get to a point where it's just not going well. And what is the recourse for a company?
Yeah, so if you guys pivot at any point, which happens, it does depend what kind of importer you're working with and your relationship with that importer. Reading over contracts, seeing what termination clauses look like. You have buyer importers who, if the producer says, you know what, we're going to use a new importer's like, sure, great, no problem. Here's a release. The new importer gets new product, and it's no problem. Other importers might have a huge issue with it, particularly if it's selling really well, right? So I really would strongly advise it looking at termination clauses or asking them, hey, what happens if we decide to move on or if we choose a different partner? Sometimes what actually can happen is if you are working with that buyer importer relationship, you can actually maintain a few at one time, as long as they know about each other. So they're gonna all have their own colas, but they're only going to register those colas in the states that they operate in. So maybe you have a West Coast importer and maybe you have an East Coast. Again, as long as they know they both exist and they're covering different territories, probably won't be an issue. If you're working with a representational importer like ASC, there's contracts in place where our clients have the right to terminate anytime the contract comes up. For us, it's annual, and no harm, no foul. Okay, no problem. We authorize whatever product might be labeled with our COLA, we authorize it over to their new importer or however our clients want, within reason, meaning that they're paying their bills. And it's, we can get them set up. We're a service company. Representational importers are always. So it's very much going to be, okay, if you don't want to utilize our services, we just need to review the contract to see when the termination date is. And we put those steps into play. It's very black and white. Because we understand in our model, people change all the time, right? They can grow and maybe they buy out. We've had companies come to us where their company has been purchased by a huge company that wanted to take everything in-house. Congratulations, that's wonderful. We will help oversee that. And guess what? Those companies, they come back a year or 2 later with a new product, and they take it through our system again. So it's no problem.
I have a question here, Chelsea, from someone listening in, but due to tech issues can't ask the question. So I have their question right here. Is there any resources available to help me determine the size of the craft spirit market at the state level? I am wanting to choose the state best for me so I can ensure my production capacity is sufficient.
There are a few. I'll look to see if they have things up to date. What I will do is if I can table answering that and potentially share some links or resources with you directly, Marissa, and then you potentially could then disseminate them. I just don't know how up to date they are. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, companies who are launching these kind of information, they're a little behind. So I'll take a look and I'll get back to you by tomorrow morning. Does that sound good? We'll have a separate communication directly.
That sounds good. Yeah, I'll include it with the link and stuff to participants and those
Great.
that registered for the webinar.
Wonderful. Fantastic question.
I said I had my last question, but another one came up. What
Great.
would be some key events or trade shows that some of these companies should attend in the U.S. to start their journey to importing to the U.S.?
Yeah. So just getting my catalog in my head. There are a bunch. That might be another email.
Yeah,
just to give you
certainly.
some, but there are a few. So things to review is basically, what categories. There's some that are wine focused, there's some that are breweries focused, there's some distilleries. And then really understanding the mission of that trade show. Some trade shows are more informative and education. Some are, hey, distributors in the room, you're going to meet them. Let's see if we can open any new markets. So I will create a resource of just there's five to seven that come to my head right away. Not only trade shows, but trade organizations here in the U.S. that are open to U.S. or companies outside the U.S. to just speak to see, get those questions out there and have more of an ongoing conversation.
Great, thank you. That would be really helpful, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Okay. I think Marissa doesn't have any questions, and I don't either. I'll quickly see, does Jay from STEP, if he has any questions on his end, if he wants to speak up?
No questions on my end. Thanks for the amazing presentation, and I learned a lot.
You're welcome, Jay. My pleasure. My pleasure, everybody. I do apologize if we are alcohol nerds here at American Spirits Exchange. So sometimes I know I speak really fast and get really excited about some of the phrases. So if there was anything that was unclear, please feel free. You have my contact, Marissa, Kellen, and Jay have my information. Don't feel free to reach out. Don't hesitate.
Great. Well, again, thank you very much, Chelsea. Very informative presentation, and thanks for answering our questions. Hopefully they were some of the questions some of the attendees would have had. And like Chelsea said, we will provide her information. We'll provide a recorded version of this, as well as some of those key links and some of those questions she's going to follow up with us. Thank you again to everybody, and we hope to have you join us in some of our upcoming webinars that we'll be hosting shortly. Thank you.
Bye all. Thank you so much for your time.